Good morning, y'all. I just finished my quiet time. It's about almost 8 a.m. and I'm sitting on my patio on my apartment, so talking a little bit quietly, but I think it'll still be okay. I recently finished reading the entire Old Testament, and I, one, never thought I could do that because growing up in a Christian home, I heard all about God and thought, yeah, I think I know basically everything there is to know about God. But after going through it, I realized that there's so much more depth to God than I was believing. I think part of what prevented me from actually reading through the Old Testament was one, pride and being ignorant to thinking that I already knew. But also, I thought I would get so lost with the complexity of it, and I thought I would honestly not enjoy God as much for who he is because of what I heard about how he was in the Old Testament or how he is in the Old Testament. But if I'm being honest, I have truly fallen more in love with God after reading the Old Testament. Time and time again throughout the Old Testament, we see the Israelites turn from God, chase their own idols, and go their own way, yet God still pursues them, and God still chooses them, even in the midst of their rebellion. He doesn't forget about them and wants them to turn from their ways and come back to him. It's like I thought I knew he was patient before reading the Old Testament, but now after reading through it, it's almost tangible because I can see it and I read it and I can read it for myself. God is such a merciful and gracious God. Throughout the Old Testament, he continues to send prophets to speak to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. He uses those prophets to warn the Jewish people to turn from their ways and to let them know what will happen if they don't. To be honest, I thought God was a distant God in the Old Testament because in my mind, I was like, well, Jesus hasn't come yet. The New Testament wasn't written yet. So how could God be as present as he was then compared to how he was in the New Testament and how he is now? There are so many signs of God through the Old Testament, whether that's Ezekiel and the fire from heaven, whether that's Moses and his miracles during the Exodus, and even the fiery furnace in Daniel where he spares them and he's present in the fire. I thought, how can anybody believe in God when Jesus wasn't around yet? But that entire second part of the Old Testament is all the prophets. God truly hates sin because he knows what's best for us and wants what's best for us. He's not like, oh, I want to withhold this from you because I don't want you to experience joy and happiness. But no, he wants us to experience that joy and happiness, and therefore wants us to turn from the things that won't bring that joy and happiness. There are moments where we see the Israelites going their own way, and God ultimately says, okay, for a time, I'll remove my hand and allow the neighboring enemies to conquer you for a time because of your rebellion. But ultimately, it's for their repentance and their turning away from their sin to follow him wholeheartedly again. But in the midst of God allowing them to go their own way, he doesn't stop pursuing them. He never forgets at them. And it's ultimately to just discipline them because discipline never feels good. But the goal is so much bigger, and that's to follow him fully. I think what's beautiful too about the Old Testament and about God is that he uses the people that the culture would think is unworthy and unfit for his using. There are entire books in the Old Testament written about women. The story of Esther and how God used her to save the entire Jewish people, the Israelites. The story of Ruth and how he used her and her kindness and to show his redemption in that book. The stories of Sarah, the stories of Hannah. Because if we're being honest, I don't think women in that culture were held to a significance like the men were. Yet God still used them and said, no, you are worthy. You have value and beauty, and I'm going to use you to fulfill my purpose and my will. It honestly pisses me off when I hear people say, oh, God is sexist, God doesn't value women, when I'm like, wait, then why are there books in the Old Testament written about women and how God used them for his purpose? Had God not used Esther and had she not obeyed, I don't know if the Jewish people would still be here. Yet through her obedience and her faithfulness to the Lord and her bravery and her courage, they were saved. When I look back and think about how I was able to be consistent, there were a couple of things. One, obviously God's grace and his empowerment for each day for me to read and just show up, even if I didn't fully understand everything that I was reading. The second thing was I tried to track my reading. I did track my reading every day, what I read. I wrote it in my notes app, and then for the month of June, I actually designed and created a tracker where I could document my rhythms throughout the month. I found it to be encouraging and inspiring to see not that it's about checking off the box and saying, oh, I did it today, but rather, how am I doing with being consistent in the word, making space for God and being present with God? If being consistent is something that you desire and you want to track your spiritual rhythms, I linked it down below for you to check out and invest in it if you want. If you choose to get it, I just want to say thank you, because it's directly supporting this channel and what we're trying to do here in this community. My challenge to you is to try reading the Old Testament by spending 15 minutes a day just reading. If you do 15 minutes a day, I think you can make it through the Bible within a year. But even if you were a bit slower, I was a bit slower on certain months and certain weeks, then you'll definitely be able to get through the Old Testament in a year. God is just so good, and I was fearful that I wouldn't love him as much as I do if I read the Old Testament, but I can say confidently that that's not the case. Even while I was reading, I wrote down all the questions that I had, because there are things I don't understand, like if we have free will, how did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Did Pharaoh have free will? And the reality is, questions aren't bad. Questions are good. But it's a matter of, am I going to find out those answers? Am I going to research it? Or am I just going to sit in the questions and not do anything about it? On the screen now is a video that I would love for you to watch next, so join me in that video.